So anything I've learned in this area is also has always been informed by Anne, and I'm sort of pleased to hear that she's been chipping away at this for about 20 years, and I'm a newbie to this. I've only been chipping away at this for about 15 years or so. So you know, it's with great pleasure I'm here to speak to such a a lovely audience, and a big audience and a diverse audience, because when we started doing this it was difficult to fill a broom cupboard with the number of people who were interested in this topic. So I'm here to talk about the implementation gap, that gap that exists between the research evidence that we generate and when that translates into changes in practice and policy on the ground. So I'll talk about the implementation gap. I'm Simon Gilbody, and I've come all the way from the University of York. It's not January 2023, it's just that I got up early today and I forgot to change the date on my slides. And I'm presenting some work on behalf of my colleagues who aren't here today, Dr. Emily Peckham, but also one I think is here, so Dr. Elena Ratchen. So I'm looking around frantically for Elena, but she's not here just yet. So here we go, hold on to your seats. What works for people with the most severe forms of mental ill health? Well, I've been chipping away at this question for 15 years or so, not as long as Anne, but we've moved the evidence along really quite rapidly in a short period of time. And I guess my frustration is that things haven't translated into practice and policy quite as quickly. So I thought I'd try to map that out, sort of looking back on 15 years worth of research. Sort of, I've got a, when should we have known things worked in this particular area of practice and policy, and how big is that gap? So that's what I'll speak to today. So I've got a simple equation at the top there, and we've spent the last 15 years or so trying to prove this really, really simple relationship, and that is the fact that behavioural support in combination with pretty much any form of medication that can help stave off some of the acute withdrawal symptoms from tobacco and nicotine cessation, are pretty much going to double your chances of effectively quitting smoking. So that's a really simple equation. And I guess the nuance has been thinking about how we can make that happen, the different, slightly more enhanced things that we have to do to make that happen within mental health services. And we've been able to do this in two ways. So the first is over on the left there, by delivering a big clinical trial. So I was the chief investigator of the Scimitar study. So we did a pilot study and then a large-scale study here in NHS services in the United Kingdom. And it was the largest study that had been done ever before. And we managed to demonstrate that this combination of behavioural support plus medications is effective in ensuring that people can effectively and safely quit smoking. So that was the main finding of the Scimitar study, and this underpins a lot of the policy recommendations that have followed on from the publication of these trial results. The final results came in about 4 years ago when we were ably assisted by lots of people in this room, not least the chair of our steering committee, and who are sat on the front row just there. But behind this, we've got a whole series of evidence syntheses, so meta-analyses, systematic reviews, where we've tried to unpick what different flavours of behavioural support and which types of medication are also effective in helping to facilitate safe and effective quitting. And our first foray into this was a meta-analysis conducted by a really smart junior doctor that was working with me at the time. And Dr. Lindsay Banham, as soon as she published this paper, she headed south on the M1 to King's College London, and I'm still smarting about the fact that Lindsay wasn't around with us for the rest of this journey. And we found more studies than we expected to there, and we came up with a really simple ethos that helped give us the confidence to move forward to undertake more trials in this area. So the same things work for people with severe mental ill health as for everyone else. Perhaps you have to try a little bit harder, but this helps us work against some of the therapeutic nihilism that we've encountered during this journey. And people will know who've been working in this area what hostility and therapeutic nihilism feels like when you try to make a difference in terms of addressing smoking. And what's been particularly gratifying is seeing some of these research findings, some of these evidence syntheses, some of these trials translate into policy recommendations, and the most recent of which is the NICE guideline that looks at tobacco addiction in particular groups, so preventing uptake and promoting quitting and treating dependence in mental health services. So we got a really clear recommendation based on level 1 evidence that was derived from some of the systematic reviews that we've done, some of the reviews that other people have done that showed that nicotine replacement, bupropion, varenicline when you can get it, and behavioural support following the National Centre for Smoking Cessation and Training, or the Scimitar model, is really effective. And the caveats there are that stop smoking support in mental health services is probably going to be more effective if it's delivered by a specialist advisor who's got mental health expertise, and if that support is tailored to the duration and intensity of that person's needs. So it's a success story, but it sort of begs the question, when should we have known this? So the thing I'm going to talk about today, which is new, is how we've used a technique, a particular evidence synthesis technique called cumulative meta-analysis, to try and understand when we should have known this. And cumulative meta-analysis is, you don't need to know too much about the technical details of that, except the fact that it's quite good for looking backwards to answer these when should we have known this kind of questions. And I first saw this used by the godfather of evidence-based medicine, Professor David Sackett, who was bothered about the fact that we knew what worked in terms of treating acute myocardial infarction, but the evidence that had been generated in robust clinical trials hadn't translated into clinical practice. So he used this technique to demonstrate the evidence gap between research and policy. So that's what we've done. We've undertaken a series of meta-analyses where you take existing evidence, and then each time a new trial comes along, you add that new trial, do a new meta-analysis, and see if the story changes. So it's quite a simple idea. It's not too difficult to undertake that, and we've undertaken this for all the trials that have ever been conducted amongst people with severe mental ill health. And there are more trials than you might think. There are 25 trials that have addressed this question. How can we help people with the most severe forms of mental ill health to quit smoking? And what I've done is I have linked it to some of the key policy initiatives and recommendations that have been made to beat ourselves up and sort of think about how we should have done this a bit earlier, and how the policy recommendations haven't necessarily translated into changes in practice. So here's quite a complex graph which tells a really simple story. So we start in the year 2000 with Tony George and Eden Evans, who started doing trials in this area, and they were quite small trials, and they proved that you could undertake trials in this population but didn't necessarily answer the question, primarily because they were quite small trials and they lacked statistical power. So we've got the trials up at the top from 2000 all the way to the most recent trials in 2020. And it starts with uncertainty based around very wide confidence intervals because we've got not much statistical power. And it moves us towards a story of certainty when we get to the most recent trials at the bottom. And it shows us that by adding trials over time, we arrive at this answer that hasn't really changed in the last 10, 15 years, that by using behavioural support and effective pharmacotherapy as support, you can pretty much double your chances of successfully quitting. So this is one of those look back and when should we have known this kind of questions. So if we start adding trials, it's small and you won't be able to see it from the back, but the answer is by the year about 2006, so nearly 20 years ago, we had sufficient randomized evidence that we demonstrate with this cumulative meta-analysis, sufficient randomized evidence to demonstrate that behavioural support plus pharmacotherapy is effective beyond the conventional level of statistical significance in enabling us to confidently say people can quit and quit effectively. So I've drawn a big red arrow there that demonstrates what I'm going to call the smoking cessation gap, this gap that exists between research evidence and where we are at the current time to demonstrate our failure to implement that evidence. And here is the rogues gallery. So up at the year 2000, we got our first trials, and then by 2006, we got smoke-free legislation, and then 2007, we had sufficient evidence from cumulative meta-analyses to show that this worked. We had a super nice guideline produced. Lots and lots of people in this room contributed to that. PH48 in 2013 made a very strong recommendation. And then it was nice to see some of those recommendations echoed in the NHS long-term plan in 2019. And then here we are back again with nice guidelines, and things really haven't changed on the ground. So there we've got a really clear demonstration of a gap between research evidence and policy. And I think it's our challenge to ensure that that gap does not continue. So I think that's our challenge here for today. So I'm looking forward to hearing about how we've been chipping away at that gap and how we will continue to do that in the future. So thank you very much.